The Enlightened Work Podcast is brought to you by Culture QI, the Culture and Talent Activation Company. With music by Geek Chorus. This episode is produced and edited by Alex Olson. For more content and engagement, follow the Enlightened Work Podcast on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok.
Welcome back to Enlightened Work, where we explore leadership behaviors that make work more human and more effective.
So, I'm so happy that you've joined us on our journey to dissect our 10 enlightened leadership behaviors, or ELBs, and make them more than just theoretical ideas. Rather, behaviors that you can put into practice. And Heather and I have talked about this on our podcast. This isn't just whether you're a leader at work, but it's your whatever organization you're part of, your coaching, your household, whatever it is, you are a leader. And these are very practical tips to strengthen those leadership skills.
And today we are tackling a leadership characteristic that gets a lot of airtime in leadership circles: authenticity. Now, when we started this podcast, Meena and I, a little over a year ago, authenticity made our top list of ELBs. But as we sat with what authenticity really means in the workplace, we have not changed our minds per se, but rather refined our word and the behavior.
That's right, Heather. And we had to, because the deeper we went into the research on authenticity and reflecting on our own leadership journeys and the leaders we've coached, the clearer it became that expecting leaders to be authentic at all costs is unrealistic and sometimes unsafe. So today we're going to talk about why genuineness is a more accurate, more usable leadership behavior and the more effective and achievable ELB, or enlightened leadership behavior.
So let's rewind a bit for our listeners. At the height of the employee engagement movement, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, many organizations encouraged people to, quote unquote, bring your authentic self to work. And I remember thinking at the time that this sounded inspiring. I mean, I certainly want to work in an environment that allows me to be authentic. But as I connected to friends who didn't share the same characteristics as me, it became clear that their ability to be authentic in the workplace was not realistic. In fact, I think with the current climate shaping our communities and places of work, being truly authentic at work could be dangerous to yourself or to others.
I totally agree, Heather, because this phrase assumes that psychological safety already exists. It assumes that your honesty won't be punished, that your emotions won't undermine your credibility. It assumes that your disclosure won't come back to bite you. And finally, frighteningly, it assumes that dare I say that we live in a bias-free world or work in a bias-free workplace. We know that none of these assumptions are always right, and they're frequently never right. So this is why it's a dangerous kind of assumption to think that psychological safety is present in the workplace.
That's right. We do not live in a bias-free society. We as humans are not bias-free. And, in that ideal workplace, which is very, very hard to achieve, but still something we should try for and strive for, you want honesty to be valued, not punished. And there is enough trust in leadership and enough psychological safety that people can actually show up to be seen, heard, and respected, even if their opinions or their lived experiences differ from others. But that's an ideal workplace. And the reality is that some environments are more conducive to authenticity than others, and some people pay a much higher price for being authentic than others.
And that's exactly where the trouble starts, especially for leaders. There was a viral moment. I don't know if our listeners will remember this. This is in about 2022. And this moment really underscored what we call the perils of authenticity. There was a small marketing company called Hypersocial. The CEO was named Braden Wallach, and Hypersocial had laid off a handful of employees. So shortly afterwards, the CEO, Brandon Wallach, posted on LinkedIn a public post with a selfie of himself in tears. In the post, he described the layoffs as the hardest thing he ever had to do. He took responsibility for the business decisions that had led to that and framed the message as an act of vulnerability and authenticity. So this fellow's intention was clear. He wanted to show that he cared. He wanted people to see that leaders aren't cold or detached, or that he isn't, and that these decisions hurt. So in many ways, it was authentic, but not the reaction was very fast and overwhelmingly negative and cringy.
Yes. I remember it was very cringy reaction. And the criticism wasn't about whether the layoffs were justified. It was about who the vulnerability centered on. So former employees of the company, leaders, and the public all made the same point. This was not the moment for the CEO's emotions.
It wasn't really about him.
No, it wasn't about him. People felt like his post shifted the attention away from those who had just lost their jobs onto his pain instead. So rather than building trust, it created discomfort, and for some, cringiness and or resentment. And so I think what this moment or that example really revealed is something that leaders often miss. Authenticity that prioritizes self-expression over role responsibility can unintentionally create emotional labor for others. And in the workplace, especially in moments of power imbalance or loss, when you are laying off people, or you've missed a significant target, or there are challenges in the business, people don't need leaders to process their feelings out loud. They need and want leaders to contain their emotion, to hold the space, and to center the people who are impacted. And that's where we think authenticity actually crosses the line, and where genuineness instead becomes the essential leadership trait. Because when you're in a leadership role, you're not just being experienced as a person, you're being experienced as a regulating force.
So let's define what that means in very real world terms. Authenticity, as it is talked about quite frequently, really means expressing your true thoughts and feelings openly and consistently, regardless of context. And that last phrase is where all the heat comes, which is regardless of context. As you've underscored, Heather, the problem with that is that leadership is context.
Yep, it is.
This is why authenticity, especially in positions of power, can actually cause harm. Not because emotion is bad, but because leaders forget who the emotion is for.
I think here's where a little bit of brain science actually will help us understand this. When we work with other humans, especially when we're in positions of authority, the brain is constantly scanning for predictability and safety. And the amygdala, the brain's threat detector, it doesn't care whether you're being authentic. It actually cares whether the message you're sending and the emotions you're sending are steady or not.
Yeah. And I'm just going to do a little detour here. The amygdala, that of course is the medical or the brain science word. The vernacular of amygdala is lizard brain. So whatever you choose to call it, it's the same thing. And back to this brain science, This is why leaders who overshare, vent, or emotionally unload, even in the name of being authentic or being real, often make teams more anxious and not more trusting.
That's exactly right. And this is where genuineness comes in as the preferred and better behavior, because genuineness is in alignment with boundaries. You're not pretending. You're also not unfiltered. You're intentional about what your role as a leader requires in the moment.
And research 100% confirms this. While authenticity can feel good internally, people judge leadership not by how honest you feel, but by whether your behavior seems appropriate, effective, and considerate. So that, again, there's so much in today's conversation that can be globalized to leadership. And I'm just going to say it again, thinking about these behaviors as appropriate, effective, and considerate are fundamentally, again, about good leadership.
Yeah, and cognitively that makes sense. So when leaders regulate their emotions and communicate with intention, it allows the team's prefrontal cortex, the executive brain, the thinking, problem-solving part of your brain, to stay online. But when leaders insist on full transparency without discernment, teams move into threat mode. There's less thinking, which means more anxiety, and that just creates less trust.
I want to make this really concrete for our listeners on what this sounds like. So what people mistakenly think authenticity sounds like are statements like, I'm just being honest, or this is how I really feel, or I don't want to censor myself. So those three statements are very commonly heard in the workplace, and they are, again, what people mistakenly think authenticity sounds like. What it looks like at work is a leader venting frustration downward, sharing doubts without direction, crossing professional boundaries, or asking teams to carry emotional weight that isn't theirs. Here's a simple example. A leader may say, I'm completely overwhelmed. I don't know how we're going to hit this deadline, and I'm worried leadership above us has no idea what they're doing. Is that authentic? Maybe. Is it genuine? No. Affirmatively not. A genuine version sounds like, this is a heavy workload, and I won't pretend it's easy. Here's what I'm focused on, and here's where I love your input, and here's where what we can influence next. So it's the same reality, it's just a very different nervous system impact.
I think that's a great example. Same reality, slightly different framing, very different impact on the receiver, on the team member. There's another excellent contrasting story to the crying CEO. And I hate to say that for him because he just got so much grief, but he's forever going to be called, I think, the crying CEO. But I think this story showcases a more genuine approach and certainly a far better outcome. So in 2020, Airbnb laid off nearly 2,000 employees, like 25% of its workforce, right in the midst of COVID because of the collapse of global travel and no one was going to rent B&Bs anymore. But instead of posting a selfie or doing a live emotional appeal or centering his own distress, the CEO of Airbnb, Brian Chesky, sent a long, detailed letter to employees just explaining the facts. This is what happened, gave the business reality. This is why the decision was made and provided clear reasoning, who exactly was affected and how. So he gave specificity, not abstraction. And he outlined exactly what support people would receive in terms of severance, healthcare, and job placement help. The letter was widely praised as a model for how to actually handle layoffs with humanity and with clarity. And here's what I think is the critical distinction between the authenticity versus genuineness approaches. Chesky didn't hide that the decision was painful, but he did not ask employees to carry his pain. He acknowledged the gravity of the moment, and then he stayed squarely in his role, that of a leader, that of a steward, and that of a decision holder. So if authenticity says, here's how I feel, genuineness says, here's what you need right now, and I can hold myself together for you. Chesky didn't deny the pain, he contained it, and that containment created trust, which is exactly what you want in difficult times.
That's so interesting, Heather. And what's even more interesting to me is that this Airbnb layoff happened 2 years before the small marketing company person decided to do his. So he clearly wasn't paying too much attention to what could have been a very useful lesson to him, unless he thought he would contrast it. But there was I'm just going to say a bit of a lack of EQ there.
Yep.
But the timing just is interesting to me. So let's get practical. Genuineness is a trainable leadership behavior. Just like all of our other 9 ELBs, enlightened leadership behaviors, we are trying to share behaviors that you can learn. We believe leadership can be developed for sure. So in terms of genuineness, here are 6 behaviors that can sort of lead you down a road of genuineness over authenticity. And there, as I said, there's 6. So I'm just going to go through these. The first one is you want to name reality without dramatizing it. So rather than saying, this situation is a mess and I am really stressed, what about saying, this is a challenging situation and we are going to give it our full attention? So the second one is share emotion with regulation. So instead of saying, I'm frustrated about this, try this instead. I'm unhappy about how this has unfolded, and I'm focused on what we can learn. That to me is just so, you're basically saying the same thing, you're just tweaking it, and it lands so differently. The third one I love, vent sideways, not downward. So it's completely acceptable and I think mentally healthy to be fully authentic with your coach, a peer, or a trusted confidant. It's just not, your team really needs clarity, not emotional processing. So you don't vent to your team. Number 4, and this also, as something else we talked about earlier, can be easily globalized to all of interactions everywhere. Before you speak, ask yourself, is this true? Is this necessary? And is this helpful for my team right now? When a fellow org dev person shared this with me for the first time, I thought, wow, workplaces would become a lot quieter if everybody put that filter through their head before they spoke. Number 5 is be consistent more than transparent. Teams trust leaders who are predictable, regulated, and steady across situations. Consistency builds trust faster than disclosure. And our 6th kind of way of moving yourself towards genuineness is model growth, not identity. A genuine leader says, I didn't handle that as well as I could have. Here's what I'll do differently next time. Not, that's just how I am. So as nerdy as it may feel or as unnatural as it may feel, I think kind of reframing each of these sentences in the privacy of your own home is actually a really good idea, because then it feels more natural, where it might feel so good to say, like, that's just how I am. That is not, that's not an effective leadership trait. That's not a good technique when you're trying to be a good leader. So whereas I didn't handle that as well as I could have, here's what I might do, what I'll do differently next time, might not roll off the tongue as pleasingly, but it certainly speaks to your executive function rather than that lizard brain.
I think those are great examples, suggestions for our listeners, and behaviors to practice that can really help us put genuineness into action. Because leadership isn't about showing up as your whole unfiltered, unregulated self at work. No, instead, it's about showing up as a steady, grounded, and trustworthy human who is in service of other people doing their best work. So authenticity on its own centers self-expression, which we don't want the focus to be, right? We want that to focus to be on genuineness, because genuineness centers impact. And in the workplace, and frankly in life, impact at the end of the day matters more than intention.
So genuineness is what allows leaders to balance honesty with care. It better matches reality with responsibility. And it allows leaders to be real without transferring anxiety, confusion, or emotional labor onto their teams. And again, I feel like there have been so many interesting nuggets as Heather and I combed through this nuanced and super vital distinction between authenticity and genuineness. But to me, this phrase that really stuck with me in terms of what makes somebody a good leader is the balance of honesty with care. And if you take nothing else away from today, I might ask you to just think about that, balancing honesty with care.
Yeah, it's a great point. And, even upon reflection, I can think of times in my own leadership journey where I was more authentic than I was genuine because I didn't have the words in the moment, and I allowed my emotions to dictate what was said as opposed to self-regulating and having a better response. And I think it's, not something that happens overnight, but in time, with intention, with practice, being able to be that person who creates steadiness is really how trust ultimately gets built. It's through consistency, it's through that emotional regulation, and the behavior that makes people feel safe enough so that they can think, to speak, and to act. So it is about turning that focus from how you are feeling in that moment about the situation to how it is that they are feeling and how do you hold their emotion, their reaction. And that's why I think genuineness isn't just a personality trait. It absolutely is, as we've determined, an enlightened leadership behavior, one that can and should be practiced and strengthened and modeled, especially when things are hard.
Absolutely. And when leaders lead with genuineness versus authenticity, work becomes more human and more effective. More effective. We all want effective workplaces. So work that becomes more human and more effective is enlightened work.
That's right. It's absolutely enlightened work. Well, that concludes our 5th ELB that we have covered in our podcast so far. We're at our halfway point to our 10 enlightened leadership behaviors. And we now have covered desire to make an impact, EQ, which actually took 2 episodes, growth mindset, optimism/hope, and now genuineness. And if you've missed a past ELB or episode, please go back and listen to the previous ones. And we hope you'll stay tuned as we still have 5 more ELBs to go, including communication, courage, humility, compassion/care, and visible commitment. And our objective with this and all episodes on the Enlightened Work Podcast is to give you suggestions for your daily leadership practices with your teams and those who you seek to lead and influence, whether that's in your business, your organization, or your community. So thank you so much for joining us today. And until next time, be the good.
Be the good.